Professor Madrid did, I want to thank Jennifer, Matias, the faculty, the University of Arizona, Asuntos del Sur, for being interested in Bolivia and for inviting me today. And I'm also honored to share the room with Professor Madrid. I remember that class he provided to my students, and thank you very much. Good to see you with the same intensity as I remember you. Thank you very much for being there, and thank you very much for caring about my country. Well, the presence of Professor Madrid shows that Bolivia was never more interesting than today. An indigenous populated state is at last governed by an indigenous president. And of course, Evo Morales is naturally at the peak of that interest. But as both of the presentations told us, public opinion is divided on Evo Morales. You will find in Bolivia, outside Bolivia, people that love him as he was some kind of a prophet, and people that hate him as he was some kind of a devil. People love him and hate him, and there is no room for ambiguity when it comes to talk about Evo Morales. And that happened to me often when I have to talk about Evo in every forum I'm invited. Whether you're a sympathizer or a critic, a supporter or an opponent, a friend or a foe, when people finishes analyzing Evo Morales, or finishes analyzing Bolivia, with an optimistic or a pessimistic focus, there is always the same expression, especially when these forums happen in Bolivia. People used to say, we deserve Evo Morales. Bolivians deserve Evo Morales. And mind this phrase, please. The expressive meaning of this phrase hides the character of this country, since Evo Morales represents both the virtues and the dilemmas, the phases and troubles of Bolivia. I've seen in all of these forums oftenly the optimistic focus that expressed that Evo Morales represents, for example, the face of the majority, the ethnic variety and the sense of inclusion, the cultural diversity, and that is doing something for the indigenous that were excluded for 100 years that nobody did before. But there is also the pessimistic focus as well. They express that Evo Morales represents the lack of education, the lack of strong state institutions, the absence of a democratic culture, and that he is dangerous for the country. But in every sense, at the end, whether you have these positive or negative perspectives, Evo Morales represents really what Bolivia is. So I'm going to change perhaps the focus of this presentation. I'm not going to talk about political science. I'm not going to talk about the state. I'm going to be a bit of a sociologist, if you let me. So I have this working hypothesis. If you want to understand Evo Morales, you have to understand Bolivia. And as Thomas Erikson once explained, Bolivia is a post-colonial society. And there were three moments where the lack of the indigenous, where the sake, of the indigenous was defined. In 1512, with the Burgos laws, the state reaped the civil rights of the indigenous, declaring them as inferior, as humans of an inferior category. So they were servants, almost slaves, for almost 200 years. And the society learned to treat them as inferior, as the law was mandated by that time. In 1825, the first Bolivian constitution committed the same mistake as the Burgos laws, as ripped their civil rights away, not giving them the right to vote, and somehow, let me explain this point with more carefulness. In the Constitution of 1825, settled that the indigenous could not vote because they didn't have an education, and that they couldn't represent a rent. So the people who couldn't represent rent, the people who couldn't read and write, were those who were enslaved for 200 years. And the last constitutional mistake, it was in 1952, where the National Revolution didn't provide them the right of owning property during the Revolución Nacional and the Agrarian Revolution. So these three moments of Bolivian historical trajectory have labeled the ethnic communities as inferior, ignorant, and poor. And these have resulted in an economic poverty, a political sense of dispossession, and social exclusion, of course, as my colleagues pointed out earlier. So Bolivia is a complex society. We lack of strong state institutions. Classes are divided ethnically and racially. The poor are the indigenous, the rich are the Spanish descendants. The social interactions are established throughout ethnic and racial categorizations. This means that we have racism, we have regionalism, we have xenophobia, we have all forms of ideological identities. And finally, that the political representation and participation are established throughout ethnic and racial interaction. This is very important to understand when we are talking about Evo Morales. Let me illustrate this with numbers. There are 36 ethnic groups in Bolivia. 62% of the population consider themselves as of an indigenous descendant, according to the census of 2001. 90% of them are Aymaras and Quechuas. 25% of the overall population are Aymaras, 30% are Quechuas, and just 70% from the lower lands. That means that two ethnicities, the major ethnicities, Aymaras and Quechuas, which are from the central Andes, are the majority of indigenous in Bolivia. 48% identify themselves as original indigenous, indígenas originarios, in the last census in 2012. What's the difference between being considered Aymara and Quechua or indígena originario? Well, the thing is that in the last census, the question was not relating the people to the ethnic groups, but to the racial self-identity. In the research I did that Jennifer mentioned earlier, in this book, Racismo y Etnicidad en Bolivia, I published a survey, and we found out that just in 2004, just 18% of the Bolivians identified themselves as indigenous. According to the last census, that number rose to 48%. This is important because racial identity was before Evo Morales a matter of exclusion. Now is a issue of inclusion. Okay. 38% of Bolivians identify themselves as of an Spanish descendant, and 58.6% of the Bolivians live below the line of poverty. That means that 8 out 10 Bolivians are poor. 9 out 10 indigenous are poor. So the poverty is mainly held in the indigenous population. I have very interesting numbers that shows how Bolivia was or is making progress in the poverty reduction. In the census of 1976, poverty in Bolivia was accounted by 85.5%. In 1992, 70.9%. And in the census of 2001, 58.6%. In the last census, held by Evo Morales' government, the poverty was reduced to 48.6%. If you look at carefully in the numbers, you will find out, surprisingly, that poverty reduction in Bolivia is the same since the 70s. We are reducing poverty at the same velocity. So it's not accurate to say that this regime or other regimes are reducing poverty in different rates. Let me explain this. The annual reduction during the state capitalism era in the 70s to 90s was 1%. The annual reduction within the neoliberalism period, was 1.33%. And during the socialism of the 19th century, of the 21st century is 1% as well. So as Bolivia has a very, very weak institutions, state institutions, one could say that we are reducing poverty thanks to gravity, because the state has nothing or very little to say in this matter. Whether you are a capitalist, a state capitalist, neoliberalist, or a socialist, Bolivia is reducing poverty at the same velocity. So the fact that now the majority of Bolivians feel that the economy is better than in the past is perhaps a sense, a sensation, not really a fact, because we are reducing poverty at the same velocity. My point here is that after all this explanation of the complex society, of these facts that classes are divided ethnic and racially, that social interaction are established throughout ethnic and racial categorization, it has become in the political ideologization of identity. Let me summarize this. The ethnic face of poverty, the white face of political representation before Evo Morales, the criminalization of the coca leaf, the alienation of natural resources has resulted in a racial nationalistic discourse. The symbolic representations of the coca next to the political empowerment of the indigenous peoples have created a racial tension towards the white elites, started to construct the new sense of belonging. This is my point. I don't think, and let me disagree with Professor Madrid, I don't think we are in front of the ethnopopulism. I think what is happening with Evo Morales is really an ethnic outcome. What's the difference? It's more important ethnic identity than the charisma or the policies of Evo Morales. As poverty has an ethnic face, politics are institutionalized throughout a racist foundation. So ethnicity went political. Now I'm going to ask to my very good friend to show the maps. In 2011, I published a book called El Eje del Más, which you guys can translate as the axis of Evo or axis of Evo. My main concern was trying to understand what was the nature of Evo Morales' vote. Can you watch the maps yet?
Can we see them? Hold on.
No, they are sharing it now. You can see it there. It's coming.
Okay. Well, there you will see, and now it's gone. There you will see the geography of the ethnic ascendments by province in Bolivia. You will notice the regions in the central Andes are the regions with the more concentration of ethnic groups. If you go to the next map, please.
No, we didn't see the first one. If not, I can upload it from here. I guess we can try. Oh no, it's a different computer. Right. Yeah, but it will come to my computer, not to that computer.
¿Por qué no reduces el tamaño? Ahí arriba, ponlo a 100. Donde dice 133%. Bueno. Ahí. What about now?
No, it's not coming.
Okay. perhaps Matthias can upload the maps from there.
I'm gonna show you from my computer. Just a second.
Ah,
Oh, there we go.
ahí
Yeah.
estuvo. Ahí estuvo.
Okay. Perfecto. Okay, there you will see the census geography, the ethnic identity geography. And as I was saying before, you will notice the darker places are the places where you have the most important concentrations of indigenous population. So, in the Andean region, which will be the west part of the country, you will have populations where, regions with more indigenous population, and in the east side of the country, the less indigenous populated regions. Okay, I put down data from the census. I wanted to understand what was the relation between ethnicity and poverty. La siguiente, por favor. There you see tabla número 1, ethnicity, mother language, and poverty by departamento. You will see that Beni, that Santa Cruz.
Bigger, Rafael? Could you make the screen bigger? Because it's very small here. Can you zoom in?
Okay. It's better like that?
It's a little better, yeah.
Yeah.
It's
I don't know if we
a
can.
little bigger. I can see. That's all that matters.
Okay. Don't mind too much about that picture. The point here is try to notice the correlation between ethnicity and poverty. Like, for instance, in Chuquisaca, you have 65% of the population identifying themselves as indigenous, and you have 70% of poverty. So there is a positive correlation between ethnicity and poverty. After I studied this data, I have a curiosity. I wanted to know what was the relation between ethnic identity and vote, and I found out a very important information. Let's go to tabla número 2, más abajo. Yeah. Can you see the numbers in this?
Okay.
In this. Yeah. Okay. You will notice as well that the correlation between vote for Evo Morales, this was the national results of 2005 election, are closer than poverty with ethnicity. So you have in Chuquisaca, 54% of the population voted for Evo Morales, and 65% have an ethnic identity. La Paz 66%, 77%, and so on. So I decided to take the coeficiente de correlación. I don't know how to say that in English, but I think all of you will understand me. Coeficiente de correlación. What was the correlation between the two factors, the electoral turnouts and the ethnicity? And I found this. Tabla 3, por favor. Vamos a pasar el mapa. La siguiente tabla. This is the correlation between vote and ethnicity, published in my book El Eje del Más in 2011. I think I'm already in my 20 minutes. I'm going to ask for 5 more. I'm finishing.
Sure, please.
Very soon. Okay. And as you will see, when you correlate ethnicity and vote, you will find out that 9 out of 10 Bolivianos that identify themselves as Bolivians vote for Evo Morales. And the correlation between ethnicity and vote is more stronger than poverty and ethnicity, as you will see in the table. This is proof that when the Bolivians are going to the elections, are thinking more. Well, one of the proofs that can take us to that analysis, that are thinking more in their identity than in the other aspects that Evo Morales can provide. My hypothesis is that even though Evo Morales could turn by any miracle to the right wing, starting to work with neoliberal policies and so on, he will still hold the ethnic vote, thanks to the fact explained before that I say that social interactions are established throughout ethnic and racial categorizations, and political representation and participation are established throughout an ethnic and racial interactions. I did the same study with the opposition. What was the vote of the opposition? As we have 72% of Bolivianos that identify themselves as indigenous, we have 38% of Bolivianos that don't. And you will deduce that these are the Spanish descendants populations. Well, the correlation coefficient is the same. 9 out of 10 Bolivianos that don't have an ethnic identity that are Spanish descendants vote against Evo Morales, whatever candidate they have to oppose him. That's how we have Tuto Quiroga, Manfred Reyes Villa, that have the same electoral turnout, one in 2005 and the other one in 2009. Both of them held almost 30% of the population. And I can say that the next candidate that opposes Evo Morales is going to reach the same amount of vote. I would like to ask, I did the same exercise with every election that Evo Morales was within. These ones are from 2005. I have tables of 2008 of the referendum, and I have tables of 2009. And the same coefficient was the result of the analysis. Let me show you the last table. La última, por favor, a la tabla 11. La última página. I tried to look to the provinces where Evo Morales was getting most of his votes, and mainly these provinces are Aymaras and Quechuas populated. Watch the close numbers between vote in 2009 and ethnicity in these provinces. For example, the first one, Aroma, which is an Aymara province in La Paz. 96% of them voted Evo Morales, and 95% of them identified themselves as Aymaras. Bautista Saavedra, 95, 97. Camacho, 96, 95. What I'm trying to say here is that the ethnic identity is far more important than ideology, for example, when it comes to vote about for Evo Morales. And it's the same in the opposition vote. So I try to find numbers where mestizos and blancos have a support for Evo Morales, but I couldn't find it. In every election, using the identity, the self-identity, the ethnic identity of 2001, 9 out of 10 Bolivianos that say that Evo Morales, that vote for Evo Morales identify themselves as indigenous, and 9 out of 10 Bolivianos that are from a Spanish descendant voted against Evo Morales. Perhaps we can stop here. I'm out of time, and we can answer questions later. Thank you very much.
So for those of you who don't tweet, you can feel free to either pass your question to me, or I guess we can have them ask questions directly, right? Or no?
Of course.
Raise your hand and ask a question. Do we have any tweets yet?
No, we don't.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, we only have now 7 people watching.
7 people in the world are watching us. We have a question back here. Could you introduce yourself and then ask a question?
My name is Ricardo. I'm from the School of Sociology. Actually, I have two questions. The first one is, in these two analyses, what is the role of military or armed forces in the Morales government? How is the relationship between Evo Morales and the military during the campaign and the government? And the second one is, how important is international issues? For instance, the conflict with Chile or the bilateral relationship with China in the Morales government.
Who wants? Should we collect a few, or do we answer them directly? And yeah, either of you can answer that, or both of you, please.
Sure, I can start. The sense is the military has mostly stayed out of politics under the Morales administration. He has mobilized the military for certain social ends, and they've been supported. My understanding is that he's has his supporters within the military. But to my knowledge, it hasn't played a big role in politics in the Morales administration. The international issues have played more of a role. Ironically, in some respects, the relationship with Chile has improved somewhat under Morales. So a lot of people, including myself, expected this to be a really tough. Morales would take a really tough stand in Chile. The relations would really deteriorate significantly. I haven't gotten the sense that they have. Certainly, the relationship between Bolivia and the United States, however, has deteriorated considerably under the Morales administration. And the Morales administration has used the United States to a degree as a punching bag. So it's accused the United States of fomenting coups and supporting the opposition. The United States certainly has supported the opposition to a degree, and that's got involved. And it's been very critical of the actions of the Drug Enforcement Agency in Bolivia and expelled them from the country. So I would say international issues have played some role in the Morales administration in particular. And Morales has also pursued closer relations with some of the U.S.'s traditional enemies in the Middle East, and China, Russia, etc. So.
Okay.
Thank you. I agree with Professor Madrid on the military. They are providing stability, but they are not involved in politics as they did in the past. And well, Evo Morales fought against the military when they were trying to protect the Connie Sanchez de Lozada regime. So again, when you have the support of the people, in what side the military play, it doesn't matter too much, because at the end, the strength of the social movements are given the legitimacy to Evo Morales' presidency. On the second thing, with China, we bought a very expensive satellite last year, and on the other hand, we don't have much relations. I think the international cooperation coming from China is very little. We don't have programs or NGOs supported by China's foundation, so it is very little. We don't have access to the sea as well, so we don't export to China or to Asia in general. But Chile always works in order to maintain nationality or nationalism. So not just Evo Morales, but every president in the past, when times go rough, a little attack on Chile doesn't do any harm. It works very well to build this nationalism that, well, with Evo Morales is a bit higher. I think the language that Evo Morales uses against Chile, it works pretty well consolidating his electorate. And on the other hand, it works very well as well in Chile, because as we are historical, as we have historical issues, the diplomatic language is used to for internal matters, for trying to maintain the support of the people, and it works that way.
Great. I have a question. I'll pose a question to each of you. They'll be slightly different. So for Professor Loayza, Rafael, all right, you've shown some very strong correlations between auto-identifiers, self-identifiers, ethnic self-identifiers, and the vote for Evo. But Evo is not the first indigenous candidate for the presidency. He's certainly not the first indigenous leader in the country. I can think of, can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
I can think of Victor Hugo Cárdenas in the 90s, but maybe someone much more polemic, Felipe Quispe, who definitely made ethnic appeals, right? Perhaps exclusive ethnic appeals, but ethnic appeals. So why is it that Evo is the one that successfully attracts that vote when past political leaders, some more prominent than others, were not as successful? So that's my question for Rafael. And then I'll ask questions to Dr. Madrid, and then I'll let you go ahead. So in terms of the policies that he's put into place, and some of these indigenous policies that he's put into place, and a lot of them sound very good. The plurinational state sounds very good. You're recognizing that there are people who identify as Bolivian, but identify as Aymara, identify as Guarani, identify as other types. We recognize that. We want to respect those rights and traditions. We want to respect your customs. I'm going to promote the education of indigenous languages and promote learning about these different cultures, these different nations. So one thing is the symbolism of all that, but then the other thing is how you sort of actually practice what you preach, right? So there's been a lot of criticism from many of Evo's supporters, Luis Tapia and others, who say, I don't know what a plurinational state means in practice, because some of the laws, some indigenous, for example, in terms of law enforcement and communitarian justice versus state justice, they conflict in terms of how you, for example, prosecute somebody who's been accused of stealing. Have there been resources channeled to promoting indigenous languages in schools? So to what extent has there been some sort of effort to, do you think, to actually put some money, some resources, attempt to implement some of these policies? And to what extent, if it hasn't happened, will those kinds of appeals eventually lose their attraction? We'll start with both of them.
I'll start. Okay. That's a very good question, Jennifer. And let me answer saying this. Well, it was a matter of time, and I think that democracy, when it was really consolidated in 1982 with Presidente Hernán Siles, it started to provide certain, how can I say, spaces of participation for indigenous. Before that, the poverty, for example, was one of those issues that was undermining the possibility of the indigenous to participate in politics. But the most important aspect of this is that in 1985, Paz Tensoro, in 1993, Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada did the Ley de Participación Popular, which started to provide the possibility of governance in the municipalities to indigenous groups. La Ley de Participación Popular was extended to education as well, letting the indigenous to learn in their mother languages, in Aymara and Quechua, and the constitution was changed as not as just a Republic of Bolivia, but as a multicultural and plurinational state in 1993. The paradox is that this was made by Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada, which is the first enemy of Evo Morales. And I think since the Participación Popular up to 2003, to La Guerra del Gas, this identity was started to be politicized. And thanks to Victor Hugo Cárdenas, you talked about him. He was not a president candidate, but he was vice president of Bolivia, of Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada, or Felipe Quispe. The way was open for indigenous chances to become presidents. I mean, before that, before Víctor Hugo Cárdenas, before Felipe Quispe, it was unthinkable to have in the ballot to any indigenous. So I think this was a process that ended in 2003 with the collapse of the neoliberalism. That since the beginning of this period of democracy in 1982, the democracy was weak. We never have a candidate that won for majority until Evo Morales. We were learning somehow to use this democracy, and government by government, regime by regime, we're providing new rights to indigenous, like those from Participación Popular, like the change of the Constitution of 1991, for instance. So I think this was a process. Before the 80s, we didn't have democracy. Before that, in the National Revolution, the indigenous didn't have the right to vote. And I think this was an accumulation of factors that ended in this eruption of social eruption that almost reaped the election of Evo Morales in 2003 with the social unrest that everyone knows about. I think it was a process.
All right, so I'm going to actually start by responding to the question that you posed to Rafael,
okay,
and then some comments that he made, and then I'll answer the other question. So I think Rafael and I agree on a number of things. So certainly we agree that Evo Morales and the MAS have done much, much better in indigenous areas than in non-indigenous areas. That's not unquestionable when you look at the provincial, municipal level data that I've analyzed in my book as well. And certainly a large part of his appeal is ethic to indigenous people. That said, and I've analyzed the individual level data from surveys, etc., that show that Morales not only he does best among indigenous people, but, for example, in 2005, he won 51% of the votes of the people who self-identified as mestizos, according to the LAPOP survey. Latin American Republican. He won 30% of the vote of the people who self-identified as white. So when you look at the individual level data, even though there is a very high correlation between the percentage of indigenous people in an area and the vote for Evo Morales, that doesn't mean that whites and mestizos aren't voting for Morales too. In the same way that there is a very high correlation between the African American population in a particular precinct and the vote for Democrats, but obviously a lot of non-African Americans are voting for Democrat as well. I'd also point out there also have been some recent indigenous presidents candidates like Loayza, who have not done well among the population. So I do think that while a very important part of Evo's appeal to indigenous people is the fact that he is indigenous, that's not all. I think there are other important parts as well. And I do think that Evo, we know from survey data that Evo has in fact won significant shares of the vote of people who have identified as white or mestizo. In terms of your question about, the policies sound really good. We've declared Bolivia a plurinational state. What does this mean in practice? Well, not always that much. I mean, this is a recurring theme in Latin America that policies look a lot better on paper than in practice. That is, they have all these grandiose, a lot of constitutions say, oh, well, do all these things, but in practice they're not implemented or they're not enforced. And that has been true to a certain extent with some of these policies. So territorial autonomy, self-governance, it's been a very slow process. I was just reading an article on the plane ride over about how slow it's been in actually implementing these policies. And I think the same, to a degree, is true in the schools in terms of the education system. Yes, there have been some changes, but they've been slow coming.
I have a question. I like to learn more about the people that are within the indigenous populations that are very heterogeneous. There has been some change. It's not homogeneous, their support, and important actors have been going against Evo, like especially after Tipnis and Itikawasu, with the extraction of natural resources and then the national park Tipnis. So to what extent are they organized group, or what are they doing now? What do we know about them? Are they a threat within yeah?
This can be a question for both of you.
It's for both. You go first, it's easier, I think.
Sure. Well, do they represent a threat? They don't. It doesn't help. It doesn't help to have an organization like CONAMAC criticizing Evo, saying they're going to run a candidate against him. It doesn't help Evo to have certain members of the MAS, like Senator Nino Bilka, coming out against him, leaving the party, denouncing him. But that said, do they represent a real threat? I don't think so. I think Evo still commands the support of most indigenous people. That is, it's that even when these other indigenous leaders peel off from him and criticize him and all that, yes, he takes a blow, but his popularity is such that I don't think it's a real risk to his electoral chances.
Yeah, I agree with Professor Madrid, and I don't think the indigenous of the lowland represent a threat for Evo Morales for merely one reason. They're just 70% of the population, nothing more. The majority are Aymaras, 25%, and Quechuas, 30%. So when Aymaras and Quechua vote for Evo Morales, 9 out of 10, it doesn't matter if the indigenous of the lowland are against him, because they don't represent more than 7% of the population. And even though they are very politicized, they held support not within the indigenous, because most of indigenous are not living in their lands. Most of the indigenous are colonizers in the lower lands. And when Evo Morales wanted to build that road, he was not thinking on the indigenous of the lowlands, but he was really caring of the indigenous migrating from the highlands. So believe me, whether this was a scandal because he was showing that Evo Morales was doing policy against indigenous interest, the indigenous Aymaras and Quechuas are very thankful for him for that road whenever it's going to be built. Going back to the little debate we're starting to have with Professor Madrid, yes, of course, mestizos and blancos vote for Evo Morales, but not in huge numbers. 10% of mestizos and blancos vote for Evo Morales, but it's not relevant compared to the 90% that votes against Evo Morales. And this was very interesting in the last election of governor in Departamento del Beni. Departamento is like you have states in the USA. Evo Morales expended $3 million. He tried to find a candidate. It was a woman, former Miss Bolivia. She was Spanish descended. She was from the elites of El Beni, because the majority of the population in El Beni are not indigenous. And he lost. He lost because and he just held 32% of the vote. If you look at the numbers, you will find out that ethnicity in Albania is 32%, and non-indigenous in Albania are almost 60%. So it doesn't matter if Evo Morales make alliances with the elites, with the white elites. He is having the non-indigenous against him in every election.
I have a question. Perhaps naive, I'm an anthropologist, not a political scientist. But this is for Rafael and then also for Raúl as the part two, is how in your co-correlation between ethnicity and votes, you were able to disarticulate class, given that I think somebody said 96%, 98% of indigenous people are poor. And I say that because also within these presentations, people talked about things like, perhaps he's not putting in a socialist government in terms of relations of production, but agrarian reform, water rights, policies to keep kids in school, literacy campaigns, health campaigns, kind of the bread and butter of people who have been exploited in your own historical frame for centuries. I think that's got to matter. It isn't just a matter of, oh boy, we might say talk Amara in school, or we might wave a symbol of indigenous identity. I think those are important to indigenous peoples, but I'm not sure this is the whole story. And then given you just spoke of the fact that other indigenous peoples run for these offices and they don't win. So something's got to be more at work here than simply ethnic pride, I think. Again, I'm an anthropologist.
You say that's a bad thing.
Okay. That's a very, very good way.
It is.
Go ahead, Rafael.
Okay, thank you very much. No, I didn't want to exclude the poverty factor of the frame. I say one of the most
class. I think there's a difference. Not just poverty, but class. And I think
class, yeah, I'm talking about class. And when I was describing the Bolivian complex society, I said classes are divided ethnic and racially as a consequence of the post-colonial society. So there is a marriage, if you wish, between ethnicity and poverty in Bolivia. 9 out of 10 indigenous are living below the line of poverty. Perhaps I didn't make it stronger, but my point is ethnicity is politicized precisely because it's linked dramatically with poverty, with class.
Yeah.
So I do think class matters in Bolivia, and I do think I'm skeptical of Rafael's claim that Evo could drift over to the right completely and start advocating neoliberal policies, and that he would retain his support among the indigenous population. Because I actually think it's a combination of those factors that have helped Evo do much better than any other indigenous candidate that ran, either in the 90s or in the 2000s. So I think it is the fact that he has this sort of broad array of policies, and I think I actually think it's not just ideology. I think it's not just identity, but I think there's some personal vote here as well. So I think it's a whole range of characteristics. So I do, back to sort of the debate that Rafael and I are having here, is I think one of the key differences here is that we're analyzing different types of data, okay? So the data I'm referring to is individual level survey data, and Rafael is analyzing municipal level data on ethnicity and the vote share. Now, of course, the problem when you're analyzing municipal level data is that, because if you have a 70% population of indigenous in a particular municipality, and you have a 70% vote for Evo, you can't make the assumption that they're all voting for Evo. That is, you have no way of actually deducing who voted for whom. It's called the ecological fallacy. You can't know exactly how they voted the individual level, which is why it is important to look at some individual level data. And so, for example, in my book, analyzing this 2006 LAPOP survey, so it showed that was taken shortly after the election, and it showed that of Evo's vote, only 28% of the people who voted for him self-identified as indigenous, okay? 43% of the people who voted for him self-identified as mestizo in this survey, but spoke indigenous language. Okay, so these are people that are sort of on the borderline of indigenous and mestizo. That is, they certainly have an indigenous background. They speak an indigenous language in addition to Spanish. But depending on how the question is phrased, they might they might self-identify as an indigenous, Aymara, Quechua, or what have you, or not. And then 19% of Evo's vote came from people who self-identify as mestizos, but only spoke Spanish, don't speak indigenous languages. And then 7% of his vote came from people who self-identify as white. Now, as Rafael alluded to earlier, all of this data on the indigenous population, what percentage it represents, is very much open to dispute, because the numbers you will get on the size of the indigenous population will depend completely on how you phrase the question. So, for example, in the 2001 census data that Rafael referred to, they asked the question, are you Aymara, Quechua, Guarani, and they gave some other indigenous categories. It did not include the choice of mestizo or white. So that's why you get 62% of the population saying, identifying with some of these categories. And many of the people who identified with one of those indigenous categories don't speak indigenous languages and aren't typically people who we would self-identify, who we would identify as indigenous. In other surveys, like the ones that Rafael referred to earlier, where they ask, are you indigenous, mestizo, white, etc., you'll only get about 20%, 25% self-identifying as indigenous. In the recent census, it was, I forget, 46%, something like that, when they phrased the question a little bit differently in that census too. So these, it's not like in the United States where you tend to get fairly consistent numbers in terms of what percentage of the population is African American, what percentage of the population is Latino, etc. Ethnicity in Latin America more generally tends to be very fluid. It will depend on contextual. People think of themselves as indigenous, but they also think of themselves as mestizo, sort of depending on the context. Or they might not think of themselves as indigenous. They're much more likely to identify with these ethno-linguistic categories that Rafael indicated earlier, like Aymara or Quechua, rather than as indigenous. So I remember when I was talking to one, I'm blanking on his name right now, but one former minister in the previous government, in the Loayza administration, he was talking about how one of his good friends, who is, quite white in appearance on the census, said, oh, do you, identify with one of these categories? He checked Aymara because he had some sort of distant Aymara background and there were no other choices. And so I think we can talk about indigenous this or indigenous that, but the fact is all of these categories are much more fluid, the boundaries are much less clear than we might expect.
Rafael, do you want to respond? You have the last word.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It would have been very boring if we didn't have a debate. So thank you very much for the the replies. I think this is going very interesting. Well, the first thing I want to say that there is two different things when we are talking about identity. One is racial identity, that is indigenous, mestizo, and whites. Another one is ethnic identity, whether you are Aymara, whether you are Quechua, Guarani, Cirono, or Castellano hablante. What's the difference? Ethnicity is inclusive. Race is exclusive. Nobody wants to be called black, nigger, Indio, but everyone wants to recognize themselves as Aymaras, Quechua. The thing is that we cannot mix both things because they are different. We cannot put together mestizo next to Aymara because are two different things. We have in La Paz mujeres, women, Aymara women that are mestizos, but they are considered themselves Aymaras. They think they have a mestizo race, but with an Aymara ethnicity. And we have whites that consider themselves Aymaras as well, as Raúl pointed out. So we cannot mix those things. And I did a survey in 2004, and I found the same data Selexon did. Just 18% of the Bolivianos in 2004 considered themselves indígenas originarios, racially. But in the same survey, I asked in the next questions whether they consider themselves Aymara, Quechua, Guaranis, and 62%, just as the census, identified themselves with an ethnicity. The thing I'm trying to say is that we don't have to confuse racial identity with ethnic identity, because of course the majority of the Bolivianos consider themselves mestizos. Okay. When I'm talking about ethnicity, I consider the non-indigenous as Castellano hablantes, not in the racial terms, because they are not relevant when it comes to compare vote with ethnicity. So this is not just a presumption or assumption when I'm saying that there is a correlation between the geography of vote and ethnicity, because I did municipality by municipality, and as you can see in these provinces, for example, Aroma, 96% voted for Evo Morales, and 95%, very high. So it's not just that I look at the numbers, but I made correlations geographically. I'm going to show you a map that shows this. El anterior mapa de ahí subite un poquito más.